The ashes of the Second World War had barely cooled when a new, chilling shadow began to stretch across the European continent. From the shattered cities and scarred landscapes, a different kind of conflict emerged, one fought not with tanks and bombers, but with ideologies, fear, and a pervasive silent dread. The year was 1947, and Winston Churchill's stark pronouncement of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe had solidified into a terrifying reality. To the west, the Soviet Union, victorious but expansionist, loomed large, its Red Army a seemingly unstoppable force that had pushed deep into the heart of Germany. The memory of swift, brutal occupation was fresh, and the prospect of a new, even more oppressive communist domination sent shivers down the spine of every Western leader. This palpable fear of a Soviet surge, a lightning-fast invasion that could sweep across the plains of Germany and into the Western democracies, became the crucible in which a radical new defensive strategy was forged. It was a strategy born of desperation and the grim lessons of the recent past, a plan to prepare not for victory on the battlefield, but for resistance in defeat. Western intelligence agencies, primarily American and British, began to conceive of a secret, subterranean network, a hidden infrastructure that would lie dormant until the moment of invasion, then awaken to become the eyes, ears, and clenched fist of a resistance movement behind enemy lines. These were to be the stay-behind networks, a clandestine insurance policy against the unthinkable. The concept wasn't entirely new. During the war, Allied Special Operations Executive (SOE) and American Office of Strategic Services (OSS) agents had successfully organized and supported resistance groups in occupied Europe, from the French Maquis to the Italian partisans. The effectiveness of these guerrilla forces, tying up enemy troops and disrupting supply lines, had been undeniable. Now the tables were turned, and the very nations that had been liberated were tasked with preparing for their own potential reoccupation. The idea was simple, yet profoundly complex in its execution. Recruit loyal citizens, train them in sabotage, intelligence gathering, and clandestine communication, and arm them with weapons and supplies, all while maintaining absolute secrecy. As the Cold War intensified, marked by events like the Berlin blockade in 1948 and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, the urgency for these networks grew exponentially. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization (NATO) was formed in 1949, uniting Western powers in a mutual defense pact. But even with NATO's collective strength, military planners harbored deep anxieties about their conventional forces' ability to withstand a full-scale Soviet onslaught. The numerical superiority of the Warsaw Pact armies was daunting. Thus, the stay-behind networks became a crucial, though entirely unofficial, component of NATO's defense in-depth strategy, a secret layer beneath the visible military deployments. Across Western Europe, from the rugged mountains of Norway to the sun-drenched coasts of Italy, small compartmentalized cells began to take shape. These were not formal military units, but rather collections of individuals, often ex-soldiers, fervent anti-communists, or simply patriots deeply committed to their nation's freedom. They were recruited quietly, vetted rigorously, and sworn to secrecy, often operating in ignorance of other cells or the full scope of the network. Their training was rudimentary, but effective. How to use explosives, how to transmit coded messages using shortwave radios, how to identify and track enemy troop movements, and how to survive in a hostile, occupied environment. Weapons, ammunition, and communication equipment were cached in remote locations, buried in forests, hidden in caves, or secreted away in abandoned buildings, awaiting the day they might be needed. The United States, through the CIA, and the United Kingdom, through MI6, played pivotal roles in establishing and overseeing these nascent networks. They provided funding, training expertise, and critical intelligence links. In Italy, one of the earliest and most extensively documented of these networks emerged, initially dubbed Organization A and later becoming infamously known as Gladio, the Latin word for a short sword, a fitting symbol for a hidden weapon. Gladio was not just an Italian phenomenon, it became the shorthand, the evocative name that would eventually encompass the entire spectrum of these secret armies across Europe, even if individual nations had their own code names and structures. By the MID-1950S, a complex, interconnected web of these stay-behind organizations was firmly entrenched across at least a dozen European countries. In France, it was known as Arc-en-Ciel Rainbow. in Belgium, SDRA-8 and STC Mob, in Germany, Galen Organization initially, evolving into later structures, in the Netherlands, INO, Intelligence and Operations. Each network was designed to be autonomous, yet ultimately answerable to a clandestine coordinating body, often operating under the auspices of NATO's Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, specifically its Clandestine Planning Committee CPC, and the Allied Clandestine Committee ACC. These committees, composed of senior intelligence officials from participating NATO nations, provided a veil of legitimacy and coordination, albeit one shrouded in the deepest secrecy. The sheer scale of this covert undertaking was breathtaking. Thousands of individuals were recruited, trained, and prepared to sacrifice their lives in the event of an invasion. They were shopkeepers, farmers, doctors, lawyers, and students, ordinary citizens entrusted with an extraordinary, perilous mission. Their existence was a state secret of the highest order, known only to a handful of government officials and intelligence chiefs. The logic was clear. If the Soviets knew of these networks, they could be easily neutralized. Their power lay in their invisibility, their ability to emerge from the shadows when all other defenses had fallen. This absolute secrecy, however, would also prove to be their ultimate vulnerability, creating a fertile ground for suspicion and controversy in the decades to come. These early stay-behind networks represented a profound shift in Cold War strategy. They embodied a grim acceptance that conventional defense might not be enough, and that the battle for Europe might ultimately be fought not on the front lines, but in the occupied villages and cities, house by house, street by street. They were a testament to the pervasive fear of Soviet expansion, a fear that drove Western powers to create an entirely new hidden dimension of warfare. These clandestine organizations were not just about military resistance. They were also designed to maintain a beacon of hope and a link to the legitimate governments in exile, ensuring that the spirit of freedom could endure even under the heel of occupation. The groundwork laid during these formative years, with the establishment of secret cells, arms caches, and communication channels, created a robust, albeit invisible, infrastructure across the continent. It was a network forged in the crucible of Cold War paranoia, a silent army waiting for a war that thankfully never came in the form of a full-scale Soviet invasion. Yet the very existence of these secret units, operating outside democratic oversight and often beyond the reach of conventional law, would eventually raise troubling questions about their activities, their control, and their potential for misuse. The shadow of the Cold War had given birth to a powerful clandestine force, a force that would remain hidden for decades, its true nature and full implications only slowly, painfully coming to light. This was the genesis of Operation Gladio, a story of secret armies and Europe's unseen web of covert terror. The shadows of the Cold War, long and unyielding, stretched across Europe for decades, obscuring a truth more unsettling than any open conflict. As the Iron Curtain began its slow, inevitable descent in the late 1980s, a different kind of curtain was unexpectedly drawn back, revealing a clandestine network of secret armies, established by NATO and the West, ostensibly to resist a Soviet invasion. Yet, the revelations that followed suggested these networks had a far more sinister domestic purpose. It was in Italy, a nation perpetually teetering on the brink of political chaos, that the first cracks in this wall of secrecy appeared. For years, the country had been haunted by a strategy of tension, a series of brutal, unexplained terror attacks that sowed fear and instability, pushing the populace towards more authoritarian solutions, and crucially, away from the rising influence of the Italian Communist Party. The official narrative often blamed leftist extremists, but a deeper, darker truth was about to emerge. By 1990, the inquiries of an intrepid Italian magistrate, Felice Casson, began to unravel a thread that led directly to the heart of the state. Casson's investigation into a 1972 car bombing that killed 3 Carabinieri officers in Piediano, initially attributed to the Red Brigades, uncovered glaring inconsistencies. His persistence eventually led him to Vincenzo Vinciguerra, a former neo-fascist operative, whose chilling testimony would blow open the entire conspiracy. Vinciguerra, already imprisoned for the Piediano bombing, declared that the attack was part of a broader, state-sponsored operation designed to discredit the left. He spoke of a covert structure, a stay-behind network armed and trained by NATO, ready to rise in the event of a Soviet invasion. But its true function, he alleged, was to destabilize Italy from within, manipulating public opinion through terror. The pressure mounted, and on October 24, 1990, Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, in a dramatic address to the Italian parliament, finally confirmed the existence of this secret army. He admitted to the clandestine unit, codenamed Gladio, meaning sword in Latin. Andreotti described it as a purely defensive, anti-invasion force, established with the full knowledge and support of NATO, and intended to operate behind enemy lines if Italy were occupied by Warsaw Pact forces. However, Andreotti's carefully crafted narrative quickly unraveled under intense scrutiny. The revelation sent shockwaves not only through Italy but across Europe, as other nations began to confront the possibility that similar secret armies existed on their own soil. The core question became, was Gladio truly just a defensive measure, or had it been repurposed, or perhaps even infiltrated, to serve a different, more insidious agenda, one aimed at domestic political destabilization? The strategy of tension had cast a long, bloody shadow over Italy for decades. It began with the Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan on December 12, 1969, where a powerful explosion at the Banca Nazionale dell'Agricoltura killed 17 people and wounded 88. Initially blamed on anarchists, the investigation was deliberately steered away from right-wing extremist groups. The true perpetrators remained elusive, shrouded in a fog of state secrecy and intelligence manipulation. This pattern repeated itself with terrifying regularity. In 1970, the Italo railway bomb near Gioia Tauro derailed a train, killing 6 and injuring dozens, again initially attributed to left-wing groups. Then came the Pidiano bombing in 1972, which Judge Casson would eventually link to the neo-fascist group Ordine Nuovo, and by extension to elements within the state apparatus. The most horrific act of this dark period was the Bologna railway station bombing on August 2, 1980, which claimed 85 lives and injured over 200. This attack, too, was initially blamed on left-wing terrorists, but later investigations, though fraught with obstruction and cover-ups, pointed increasingly towards right-wing extremist groups with deeply troubling connections to elements within the Italian secret services and, by extension, to the Gladio network. Vincenzo Vinciguerra's testimony was critical. He explicitly stated that the purpose of these attacks was to force these people, the Italian public, to turn to the state to ask for greater security. He added, "This is the political logic that stands behind all the massacres and the bombings which remain unpunished, because the state cannot condemn itself or declare itself responsible for what happened." This was the chilling essence of the strategy of tension, terrorizing citizens to accept a stronger, more authoritarian state, and to reject any move towards left-wing politics. The very structure of Gladio facilitated this potential for abuse. It was a deeply compartmentalized, highly secretive organization, drawing recruits from right-wing circles, former fascists, and individuals with strong anti-communist sentiments. They were trained in sabotage, guerrilla warfare, intelligence gathering, and clandestine communication. Arms caches, often hidden in remote locations across Italy, contained a formidable array of weaponry: explosives, automatic rifles, anti-tank rockets, far exceeding what a simple defensive resistance force would typically require. The existence of such a network, operating largely outside democratic oversight and parliamentary control, presented a profound challenge to the rule of law. The question was not just star who star was involved, but star who knew star. Prime Minister Andreotti, in his parliamentary disclosures, confirmed that Gladio was coordinated by the NATO Clandestine Planning Committee (CPC) and the Allied Clandestine Committee (ACC), operating under the Supreme Allied Commander Europe Sacyr. This implied direct involvement, or at least tacit approval, from the highest levels of the Western military alliance. Across Europe, similar stay-behind networks began to be exposed or admitted to. Belgium, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Austria, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Turkey, nearly every NATO member, and even some neutral countries had their own secret armies, often operating under different code names. The Italian revelation suggested that these networks, originally conceived as a last line of defense against a Soviet invasion, had developed a dangerous dual-use capability, susceptible to being turned inward. The scandal plunged Italy into a deep political crisis. Public outrage demanded answers, but true accountability proved elusive. Decades of investigations, trials, and parliamentary commissions were met with stonewalling, missing documents, and the convenient deaths of key witnesses. The full extent of Gladio's involvement in the strategy of tension and the complicity of elements within the Italian state and its international allies remains a subject of intense debate and unresolved questions. The legacy of Operation Gladio is a profound erosion of trust. It exposed the unsettling reality that democratic governments, in their zeal to combat communism, had established covert structures capable of operating beyond the reach of democratic institutions. It raised fundamental questions about the nature of national security in a Cold War context and the fine line between defense and domestic political interference. Was Gladio repurposed by rogue elements, or was its potential for domestic disruption an inherent, perhaps even intended, part of its design from the very beginning? The answers remain buried, much like the arms caches themselves, in the fertile, often bloody ground of Europe's post-war history. The shadow of Gladio continues to remind us that behind the visible machinations of state, an unseen web of covert power can weave a narrative of terror, shaping public life in ways few ever truly comprehend. The whispers began in Italy. In the autumn of 1990, Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti's startling admission to the Italian parliament unveiled Operation Gladio, a clandestine stay-behind army armed and trained to resist a Soviet invasion, but also implicated in decades of domestic political intrigue and terror. For years, the official narrative had been clear. This was a uniquely Italian entanglement, a dark chapter born of specific national circumstances. But as the dust settled on Rome's revelations, a far more unsettling question emerged, echoing across the continent. Was Italy an isolated case, or merely the tip of a much larger pan-European conspiracy? The answer, as subsequent investigations and disclosures would painfully reveal, pointed to a vast, unseen web of covert networks stretching from the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean to the frozen fjords of Scandinavia. These were the secret armies of the Cold War, established under the aegis of NATO and Allied intelligence services, designed to activate in the event of a Soviet occupation. Their mission was clear: sabotage, intelligence gathering, and partisan warfare behind enemy lines. But their very existence, shrouded in absolute secrecy and operating beyond democratic oversight, harbored a darker potential, a capacity for unintended consequences, and, as many alleged, deliberate manipulation of European democracies. The trail of these shadow organizations led investigators into the heart of Belgium. Here, the existence of a stay-behind network, often referred to by its intelligence designation SDR-88, was confirmed, though full details remained elusive. Public inquiries in the early 1990s wrestled with allegations that elements within this network, or groups closely associated with it, had veered dangerously into domestic extremism. The Front de la Jeunesse, a right-wing paramilitary organization, was scrutinized for its alleged ties, raising uncomfortable questions about the fine line between defending the state and undermining its democratic foundations. While direct Gladio involvement in the infamous Brabant massacres of the 1980s was never definitively proven, the proximity of these secret structures to far-right elements fueled persistent suspicions. Across the Rhine, Germany presented an even more disturbing picture. While initial official denials were robust, it became impossible to ignore the mounting evidence. Germany's secret army, known as the Technischer Dienst Technical Service, or in its earlier iteration, the Bund Deutscher Jugend (BDJ), was a particularly contentious example. Exposed in the early 1950s, the BDJ had been found to harbor extreme right-wing elements and was alleged to have compiled death lists of socialist politicians, including the then leader of the Social Democratic Party, Erich Ollenhauer, for assassination in the event of a communist takeover. These early revelations were largely suppressed, but they foreshadowed the later Gladio scandal, revealing a deep-seated willingness within certain circles to bypass democratic norms for perceived national security. Switzerland, a nation synonymous with neutrality, seemed an unlikely candidate for such a clandestine network. Yet, in 1990, a parliamentary report by Judge Cornelius Koch unveiled P26, Project 26, a highly secretive stay-behind organization. Unlike some of its European counterparts, P26 was explicitly designed for resistance and intelligence gathering, with clear links to British MI6. However, its existence kept secret from the Swiss parliament and the public for decades, ignited a fierce debate about the erosion of national sovereignty and democratic accountability. Allegations surfaced that P26 had developed plans for the surveillance of domestic left-wing groups, blurring the lines between external defense and internal political policing. Colonel Herbert Alboth, the network's commander, found himself at the center of a national scandal that shattered the myth of Swiss political purity. The tapestry of Gladio-like networks extended far beyond these prominent examples. In the Netherlands, an organization known as OI Opsporing in Inlichtingendienst, Investigation and Intelligence Service, operated in similar secrecy, eventually leading to a parliamentary inquiry that confirmed its existence and links to NATO. Austria's Österreichischer Wander, Sport- und Gesellschaftsverein, OSGV, ostensibly a hiking club, was exposed in 1990 following the discovery of hidden arms caches, revealing its true nature as a stay-behind network with alleged ties to German counterparts. Even Nordic nations like Norway, with its ROC Radio-Organisasjonen Celler, and Denmark with Absalon, maintained clandestine cells, albeit with a stronger emphasis on intelligence and communications in the event of occupation. The common threads running through these disparate national entities were undeniable. All were conceived in the paranoia of the early Cold War, driven by the existential fear of Soviet expansion. All operated under layers of extreme secrecy, often known only to a select few within the highest echelons of military and intelligence establishments, deliberately shielded from democratic oversight. Their structures typically involved small, compartmentalized cells, trained in sabotage, clandestine communication, and guerrilla warfare, supported by hidden caches of weapons and explosives. Recruitment often drew from ex-military personnel, fervent anti-communists, and disturbingly, sometimes elements from the far right or even criminal underworld, selected for their loyalty and willingness to operate outside conventional norms. The role of NATO in coordinating these networks was initially vehemently denied, then grudgingly acknowledged. The Alliance's Clandestine Planning Committee (CPC) and later the Allied Clandestine Committee (ACC) served as crucial forums for the exchange of information and strategic planning among member states regarding their respective stay-behind organizations. While NATO consistently maintained that these committees were purely defensive and focused on resistance against external aggression, the reality on the ground in many countries suggested a more ambiguous and potentially dangerous trajectory. The lines between external defense and internal political maneuvering became dangerously blurred, raising profound questions about the true extent of NATO's involvement in, or awareness of, the alleged domestic abuses of some of these networks. This ambiguity fueled the most persistent and damning allegations against Gladio and its European counterparts, the strategy of tension. This theory posited that elements within these stay-behind networks, or groups manipulated by them, engaged in false-flag terrorist attacks, designed to sow chaos, discredit left-wing political movements, and push public opinion towards stronger, more authoritarian governments. In Italy, the Bologna railway station bombing of 1980, the Piazza Fontana bombing of 1969, and numerous other acts of terror were fiercely debated in relation to Gladio's alleged involvement, even if direct, conclusive proof of command and control links remained elusive in many cases. The sheer weight of circumstantial evidence and the admitted presence of right-wing extremists within these structures, however, continued to fuel deep suspicion. Beyond Italy, similar allegations surfaced. In Belgium, the Brabant massacres, a series of brutal supermarket robberies and murders in the 1980s, were linked by some investigators to state security elements and far-right groups, some of whom had alleged connections to Belgian stay-behind networks. In Turkey, the Counter-Guerrilla, a deep state organization widely seen as Turkey's Gladio equivalent, was implicated in political assassinations, torture, and a broader campaign of intimidation against left-wing activists and Kurdish separatists, creating a climate of fear that profoundly shaped Turkish politics for decades. These instances, whether fully proven or remaining as potent allegations, painted a chilling picture of a continent where secret armies, ostensibly created to defend democracy, were instead accused of undermining it from within. The European Parliament, in a landmark resolution passed on November 22, 1990, condemned the existence of these clandestine networks, expressing serious concern about their lack of democratic control and the potential for illegal interference in the internal affairs of member states. This resolution marked a crucial moment, acknowledging the pan-European scope of the Gladio phenomenon and demanding full investigations and transparency from national governments. Yet, despite this parliamentary condemnation, the full truth about Europe's secret armies has never been entirely revealed. Many archives remain classified, key figures have passed away, and official narratives often remain incomplete or contradictory. The legacy of Operation Gladio and its European siblings is one of enduring suspicion. It exposed a fundamental tension at the heart of Cold War democracies: how to protect the state from external threats without inadvertently creating internal threats to its own democratic principles. The existence of these secret armies, operating outside the rule of law, recruiting potentially unstable elements, and allegedly engaging in covert political manipulation, left an indelible scar on Europe's political landscape. It served as a stark reminder that even in the defense of freedom, the mechanisms of power can become dangerously opaque, casting long shadows of doubt that continue to influence how Europeans view their governments, their security services, and the unseen forces that may still shape their destinies. The unseen web, once thought dismantled, continues to haunt the collective memory of a continent grappling with the ghosts of its secret past. The dust settled, but the shadows endured. The revelations surrounding Operation Gladio, NATO's clandestine stay-behind armies, tore through the veneer of post-war European democracy, exposing a hidden architecture of state power that operated beyond public scrutiny, beyond parliamentary oversight. What began as a defensive bulwark against a feared Soviet invasion morphed, in the eyes of many, into something far more sinister: a network implicated in domestic destabilization, political manipulation, and even acts of terror that scarred a continent. The initial shock of discovery, particularly in Italy in the early 1990s, gave way to a chilling realization that the full story remained largely untold, its implications profoundly unsettling for the very fabric of democratic governance. For decades, the existence of these secret armies was vehemently denied. Then, in 1990, Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, under intense pressure from Magistrate Felice Cason's investigation into the 1972 Piano car bombing, finally confirmed Operation Gladio's existence. He admitted to a structure of information, response, and guarantee designed to resist a Soviet occupation, revealing its code name and its links to NATO. This was not an isolated Italian phenomenon. Similar clandestine cells, under various names like P26 in Switzerland, Absalon in Denmark, or SDR-8 in Belgium, were found to exist across at least 12 Western European nations, all ostensibly reporting to NATO's Clandestine Planning Committee (CPC) and Allied Clandestine Committee (ACC). But the official narrative, stressing purely defensive preparations, quickly unraveled under the weight of mounting evidence and accusations. The ensuing parliamentary inquiries across Europe were, for the most part, a study in limited accountability. While Italy's investigations, particularly the work of the Parliamentary Commission on Massacres, delved deepest, uncovering connections between state security services, right-wing extremist groups, and elements of the Gladio network, other nations offered only grudging acknowledgments or outright denials. Belgium and Switzerland conducted some inquiries, but ultimately offered little in the way of comprehensive disclosure. In countries like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, official responses ranged from dismissive silence to outright stonewalling. The prevailing sentiment among many European governments was to contain the scandal, to minimize its scope, and to avoid any full, frank reckoning with the uncomfortable truths it unveiled. NATO, for its part, maintained a consistent position that the stay-behind networks were purely defensive, and that any alleged involvement in terrorism was a national matter, divorced from the alliance's mandate. This stance, however, did little to quell the rising tide of suspicion. The enduring legacy of Operation Gladio is perhaps most acutely felt in the profound erosion of public trust in governments and intelligence agencies. For decades, citizens had been told that their democracies were secure, their institutions transparent. The revelation of secret armies operating within their borders, often with hidden weapons caches and links to extremist elements, shattered that illusion. It fueled the insidious notion of a deep state, a shadowy cabal of unelected officials and security operatives pulling strings behind the scenes, manipulating political outcomes, and even orchestrating violence to achieve undeclared objectives. This perception, once dismissed as fringe conspiracy theory, gained a chilling plausibility in the wake of Gladio, making it harder for official narratives to be accepted at face value, even on unrelated matters. The psychological impact on nations like Italy, which had endured years of strategy of tension, a period marked by devastating unexplained bombings and political assassinations, was particularly severe. Events like the 1969 Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan, the 1980 Bologna railway station massacre, and the kidnappings and murders carried out by the Red Brigades were now viewed through a new, unsettling lens. Were these truly the work of isolated extremist groups, or were they, at least in part, orchestrated or manipulated by elements within the state, perhaps even linked to Gladio, to sow chaos and push for authoritarian solutions? The unanswered questions continue to haunt these nations, leaving a deep scar on the collective psyche and fostering a pervasive skepticism towards authority. Even today, 3 decades after Andreotti's admission, a multitude of critical questions remain unanswered. What was the true extent of NATO's oversight over these clandestine operations? To what degree did the CIA and MI6 influence or direct Gladio activities? Beyond simply providing training and equipment, how many weapons caches were truly discovered, and how many remain hidden, their contents unknown? Most disturbingly, the precise nature of the alleged false flag operations, actions designed to be blamed on political opponents to justify repressive measures, continues to be debated. Who authorized them? Who carried them out? And who, at the highest levels of government and intelligence, knew about them and chose to remain silent? Consider the Brabant massacres in Belgium, between 1982 and 1985, a series of brutal, seemingly random supermarket robberies that left 28 dead. Despite exhaustive investigations, the perpetrators were never definitively identified. Yet persistent theories link the killings to elements of Belgium's own stay-behind network, the SDR-88, or to far-right paramilitary groups with potential ties to state security. The motive, some suggest, was to destabilize the country, to demonstrate the state's inability to maintain order, and perhaps even to justify a shift towards more authoritarian governance. The chilling possibility that such events were not random acts of criminality, but rather calculated acts of state-sponsored terror, even if through proxy, continues to cast a long, dark shadow over European history. The enduring relevance of Operation Gladio extends far beyond historical curiosity. It speaks directly to contemporary geopolitical discourse and the ongoing struggle for democratic oversight in an increasingly complex world. While the Cold War threat of Soviet invasion has receded, the tools and tactics of covert operations, state secrecy, and deniable intervention have not. Instead, they have evolved, adapting to new threats and new technological frontiers. The concept of hybrid warfare, for instance, now widely discussed in military and intelligence circles, describes a blend of conventional, unconventional, and cyber tactics designed to destabilize adversaries without direct military confrontation. This includes disinformation campaigns, proxy conflicts, and the manipulation of domestic political processes, tactics that bear a striking resemblance to some of the alleged actions attributed to Gladio. Today, intelligence agencies and special forces units across the globe operate with levels of secrecy and autonomy that often challenge traditional democratic accountability. The rise of mass surveillance, the use of drones for targeted assassinations, and the proliferation of cyber warfare capabilities all raise fundamental questions about the balance between national security and individual liberties, between state power and democratic transparency. The legacy of Gladio serves as a potent reminder that unchecked power, even when wielded with ostensibly good intentions, can lead to devastating consequences, undermining the very democracies it purports to protect. The argument that such secrecy is necessary to counter evolving threats rings hollow for those who remember the lessons of the past. The challenge for modern democracies is to find mechanisms for robust oversight that can penetrate the veil of secrecy without compromising legitimate security operations. This requires courageous investigative journalism, independent parliamentary commissions with real power, and a public that remains vigilant and questioning. The temptation for states to operate in the shadows, to conduct operations with plausible deniability, and to prioritize perceived security over transparency remains a constant. The story of Gladio is not merely a historical footnote. It is a cautionary tale, a perpetual warning etched into the consciousness of Europe. The unanswered questions from the Gladio era continue to resonate, not just as historical curiosities, but as vital lessons for navigating the complexities of modern statecraft. How do we ensure that the instruments of state power, designed to protect, do not become instruments of oppression or manipulation? How do we reconcile the undeniable need for intelligence and security with the fundamental principles of open government and democratic accountability? The shadow of Gladio, long and unsettling, reminds us that the fight for transparency and truth is an ongoing struggle, a constant vigilance required to prevent the unseen web of covert terror from ever again entangling the heart of Europe. The legacy is not just about what happened, but about what could happen again if we fail to learn from history's darkest corners. Subscribe to Steady Z for more contents like these.